Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Sunday, everybody. Today's video will be something a little different to what we usually do. Professor Zhang is a distinguished professor of humanities and social sciences and dean of the School of Economics and director of the Research Institute of Chinese Economy at China's prestigious Fudan University in Shanghai. This guy is a big deal, and recently Professor Zhang gave an interview with Shanghai-based outlet Guancha, The Observer, in which he made very important and very politically incorrect statements about China's economic outlook. For example, Zhang believes that China's economic slowdown is not a short-term recession, as state media has claimed, but an inevitable, prolonged trend of slowing growth, a theme which we have explored on China Update. This is an important interview for several reasons. First, it's a prominent and respected voice from within China on the economy, rather than a foreign observer. And secondly, it shows that some of the concerns which regular China Update viewers will be quite familiar with are now being recognized and loudly discussed in elite circles within China itself. Frankly, it's also a good opportunity to let a prominent thinker unpack their ideas at length on the economy and outlook, rather than in short quotes which we normally examine on China Update. Doing a long-form examination on a commentator takes space, which is why we're doing it here with a Sunday video, rather than a regular Monday through Saturday video. Now, as we examine these comments made by Professor Zhang, we remember that he is an elite Chinese speaker, operating within the mainland, speaking to a domestic audience. So this will affect his language, and he needs to be careful and diplomatic with what he says. However, this does make some of his more frank assessments of the economy even more telling. The interview, which we will quote selected excerpts from at length directly, has been translated by the excellent team at The East is Red, with red spelled R-E-A-D. I should also say in advance that I am suffering from a very mild flu, and so I am a little bit blocked up. Hopefully this does not affect the quality of the audio too much. My apologies if it is distracting. However, if you enjoyed today's episode or get some value from it, as always, liking and subscribing is a massive help. It's the best way to help the channel grow on the platform, and for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Okay, let's begin with the interview. Question. Generally speaking, L-shape refers to an L-shaped recession, implying a prolonged downturn. But the current Chinese economy is neither in recession nor depression. How do you think we should understand and summarize the current economic situation in China? Answer. It's the job of economists to define evolving economic phenomena, hence the introduction of new concepts for new trends. For most developed economies, crises or external shocks in the short term would often result in negative economic growth, what is called a recession. If the recession is not reversed for an extended period, it may evolve into what is called a depression. But looking at China, it still has economic growth of around 5 to 6% each year, which cannot be called a recession. Compared to 10 years ago, China's GDP growth rate has come down, but not sharply, rather slowly. Regarding the past few years, the slowdown of China's economic growth from a high level, forming an L-shaped slowdown trend, seems to be related to the government no longer continuously stimulating investment as before. I increasingly feel that the growth slowdown has a certain inevitability. It cannot be simply understood through the framework of macroeconomic analysis, nor should it be interpreted as a lack of sufficient intervention in total demand. I remember in the winter of 2003. At that time, China experienced moderate tightening in macroeconomic terms, but its GDP still grew at slightly more than 8%, although it slowed down significantly from the previous growth of over 10%. The key difference now is that China's current economic slowdown exhibits a long-tail phenomenon, indicating an inability to revert to previous growth levels in the current economic climate. Question. What deep-seated reasons are behind the slowdown in growth do you think need to be studied and explained? Answer. What needs attention is that in the medium to long term, China's GDP growth rate is indeed slowing down. The slowdown is a trend, not a short-term downward phenomenon. So I don't think it's just a simple demand contraction or a problem with the so-called three driving forces of the economy: investment, consumption, and export. As an aside, once again, this is very much out of line with the official state media line that China is seeing a temporary economic malaise caused by the pandemic and a hostile international environment. We continue with a direct quote. Simply put, ensuring a reasonable growth in overall productivity in the future is crucial. The problem is, it is extremely difficult to prevent the overall productivity from dropping in the next few years, which would drag down the potential growth rate. If you have been paying attention to Economist's research papers recently, you will notice that after 2008, China's productivity growth indeed entered a slowdown. A clear slowdown. Some studies have also confirmed that the slowdown in productivity is largely the result of a high investment-driven growth model. Again, this will be a very familiar theme for regular China Update viewers. The slowdown in China's productivity is not solely due to the deceleration associated with technological advances. A significant contributing factor is the long-term inefficiency in capital allocation. Many economists have highlighted that the Chinese economy has long suffered inefficient capital allocation and resource misallocation. Moreover, this issue appears to be increasingly severe at the grassroots level. Question: is it because the systemic financial risks are too high that they have alerted the central leadership? Is it that they have no choice but to hit the brakes and regulate their finances? Answer: regulation and rectification of the financial sector have been a part of China's macroeconomic regulation and have occurred multiple times in the past. However, more recent statements from the central leadership marked a departure from previous assessments. It suggested that China's previous growth model was unsustainable and needed correction. This was a significant change. This change indicates that the top leadership also believed that the economic slowdown in the preceding years was not merely cyclical, but possibly structural. Of course, this is also controversial in the field of economics because there is no consensus on how to transform the growth model. Theoretically, marketization is the fundamental solution to overcoming inefficiencies and misallocation of capital distribution. But there is no breakthrough in researching a consensus on implementing marketization to address these issues. As an aside, this is quite the statement. This is a very diplomatic way of saying that policymakers and leadership are operating in the dark and are not sure exactly how to proceed with the economy. I've noticed that the top leadership has gradually accepted this narrative and that the country's economic development was facing three simultaneous challenges, namely having to deal simultaneously with the slowdown in economic growth, making difficult structural adjustments, and absorbing the effects of the previous economic stimulus policies. In my view, the top leadership has indeed showed unprecedented determination and resolve. However, the challenge lies in the inadequacy of marketization, which has not become the decisive force in structural adjustment. In the shift towards new growth drivers, the government has paradoxically intensified the implementation of industrial policies. This is highly concerning, and I fear it might lead to new, complex problems later on. For instance, overinvestment still prevails in many key areas, such as lithium batteries, new energy vehicles, carbon neutrality, and energy storage. The government has guided or intervened in research allocation through industrial policies, which is problematic. In any field that becomes a hotspot, the government will guide the market to increase investment in that area. Excessive capacity will ultimately lead to a deterioration in the industry's profitability, R&D capabilities, and overall investment returns, creating substantial debt for banks. Question: you believe that the fundamental reason for the economy slowdown in the past 7 or 8 years was the slowdown in productivity, which in turn is closely correlated with overcapacity. I noticed that Mr. Yu Yongding, this is the academician of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China, and a voice we have explored in previous China Update videos, recently mentioned the point of view that overcapacity is a structural and industrial problem. He believes that the primary challenge facing China's economy over the past decade has been a lack of sufficient total demand, rather than an issue of overcapacity. What is your view on this? Answer: as for the current monetary and fiscal policies, China's GDP growth rate has hovered around 6% with a nominal growth rate of around 8%. In recent years, including this year, the amount of money injected into the economy, both in total and in terms of growth rate, has been substantial, outpacing the growth of nominal GDP. This indicates that liquidity is not in short supply, and policies may not be as tight as perceived. Nonetheless, there is still pressure to stabilize the economy. Therefore, the crux of the problem is not whether to further stimulate infrastructure investment by releasing more liquidity, but rather about concentrating on enhancing China's potential growth rate trend. Currently, the Chinese economy faces many uncertainties and challenges, and under these circumstances, it is prudent for macroeconomic policies to maintain a cautious approach, steering clear of the risks associated with over-adjustment and volatility. Here ends our examination on Professor Zhang's comments, but we will not end the video quite here. Professor Michael Pettis of Peking University, who we quote often on China Update, recently published his own reaction to Professor Zhang's interview, and especially in response to the point raised in the last question from Yu Yongding. We end with some of his thoughts. Quote, "I have long argued that this misallocation of capital, formerly mainly in property and infrastructure, now mainly in manufacturing and infrastructure, is driven by the need since 2006 through 2008 to achieve politically determined GDP growth targets that exceed the real growth capacity of the underlying economy. This requires far more government or bank-driven investment than can be economically justified. Hence its misallocation. And one inevitable consequence is the much faster growth in debt than in GDP since then. But while most Chinese economists are now willing to acknowledge that China has a serious problem of misallocated investment, so far most solutions proposed in public are to marketize the investment allocation process and so improve its efficiency. Indeed, as we just saw, this was one of the main arguments pushed by Zhang. The idea that there are not enough productive investment opportunities that have simply been missed, and it will be possible to shift investment from the former to the latter without slowing the economy, is an attractive one, but I think it simply isn't true. Just consider the sheer extent of China's over-reliance on investment. After 30 years of having the highest investment share of GDP in history, and by a very wide margin, China would have to reduce the investment share of its GDP by 1/4 just to match other countries with extremely high investment shares. Developing countries in the midst of their growth booms. China comprises nearly 18% of global GDP, roughly 13% of global consumption, and over 32% of global investment. Few economists still think this is sustainable, but not as many are yet willing to acknowledge the implications for growth. It may take another year or two for this to happen." End quote. Just another reason why this year will be so critical and interesting to follow China. Okay, that is today's special Sunday episode of China Update. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. My apologies once again for my blocked nose. Hopefully it was not too distracting. Have a lovely weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.